Unreal is a first-person shooter developed by Epic Games and published by GT Interactive in 1998. The game runs under the engine of the same name and had multiple delays in its release to get the thing working. You could say the whole project from inception was unreal, but the end result is what matters the most. You take on the role of Prisoner 849, traveling aboard the prison ship Vortex Rikers. The ship crash lands on the planet Na Pali, populated by a tribal race of four-armed humanoids called the Nali. The planet is under control of the Skaar, a race of technologically advanced reptilians. Liberating them is tempting, but your goal is not one of being a hero or doing the right thing. You're trying to escape, though the gameplay is fairly standard, at least for a game from the 90s. You progress through the game in a level-by-level fashion, throwing switches, killing monsters with badass weapons, and making your way to the end. The standard formula for weapons of the time was a pistol, a shotgun, a machine gun, and a rocket launcher. Unreal has a similar set of weapons, but they wanted to stand out. Every weapon was unique in its own way, and they all had a secondary fire mode to make them versatile enough for a variety of combat situations. Some would argue that it's the weapons that define the series. Weapons like the 8-ball launcher. It's a 6-barrel rocket launcher. 6 of them! You can fire guided rockets or lob them like grenades. The flak cannon fires shells shotgun style, or as a grenade, and it's one of my favorite weapons in the series. The bio rifle fires toxic sludge that sticks to surfaces and behaves like landmines, so you can lay down some temporary traps in a corridor. One of the more iconic weapons is the Smd Shock Rifle. The primary fire is a hit-scan beam, and the secondary fire is a more powerful but slow-moving projectile. You shoot this projectile with a primary fire, and you generate a really powerful explosion that just decimates everything around it. And here's a fun fact. ASMD officially stands for "And Suck My Dick." I never knew this. Now I do. And so do you. The monster placement is actually somewhat random. They still get pre-placed by the level designer as usual, but there's a chance they may not appear in a specific area, so a corridor filled with enemies for one player may be completely empty for someone else. Some enemies may even appear in places you wouldn't expect. I freaked out in a couple instances when I'm waiting for a lift to come down, and there's a monster on there already with a rocket in my face. It's the kind of level design that keeps you on your guard, and all the baddies that populate the world ensure you are awake for them. The vast majority of the monsters you encounter are Skaarj soldiers, all with varying names and weapons. It's hard to differentiate between them until you see them attack. The approach to dealing with them is in dealing with their weapon, but that's oversimplifying things because the Skaarj soldiers all have a very aggressive combat AI. They will sidestep your attacks and close the distance on you very quickly. They can even feign their own death to trick you, so sometimes it's not another monster spawning, it's the same monster tricking you into thinking you killed them. In most games, the first hour or so will ease you into the game by throwing some cannon fodder your way. Here in Unreal, the first enemy you meet has rocket launchers. They're here to kick your ass. The movement system lends itself to this as well. Double tapping the movement keys will cause you to perform a quick dodge in that direction, and this is absolutely necessary because the enemies will predict where you're moving and fire in that direction. Performing a dodge will allow you to avoid damage that you would otherwise receive when moving normally. If you wanted a challenge, here you go! But I would advise caution when changing the difficulty level. Increasing the difficulty increases their health and their damage against you. It doesn't necessarily make it more difficult. They just become bullet sponges, and it forces you to use your starting weapon as much as possible to save ammo. This is the kind of difficulty scaling I do not like. Make me try harder to aim at a more agile enemy, or make me kill more of them, but don't make me use more ammo just because. Not everything you come across is out to kill you. The Nali populate the villages and temples on the planet, so you can't just kill everything that moves. Well, you can, but you'll miss out on many of the secrets they'll reveal to you. Extra items and ammo you need are usually hidden in areas that only the Nali can unlock. The secret areas that don't involve the Nali are very difficult to find, so the secrets really are kept secret. I really like how they set this up. You're rewarded for not killing them, or rather, keeping them alive. The Skaar will go after them as well, and if you can protect them, the Nali in the later levels will help you out. The story and your means of progress are told through the translator. When you come across a journal or an alien cipher on the wall, it gives you clues on what you need to do to move forward, like deactivating a force field or finding a hidden passage in a prison. Not everything will help you progress. Many of these alien texts are there to expand on the story, what's going on between the Nali and the Skaar, and the perspective of things from both sides. But if you're not too concerned about the story, it doesn't interfere with the game at all. The clues are easy enough to figure out, but the levels can be confusing at times. I don't mind exploring the area to find a switch, but it gets frustrating when I have to travel back and forth between the same areas 5 or 6 times because it's unclear what a switch does, or I can't even find the switch at all. But then you eventually find that one hidden corridor that was never intended to be hidden, and then you forget everything that happened because you go back to blowing stuff up and having a good time. That's one of the things that frustrates me with games from the 90s, but thankfully it's not a major problem. Unreal was the first game to feature full support of Creative's EAX technology on their Sound Blaster cards. It was essentially the killer app that pushed their hardware sales, but the game sounded absolutely amazing even without it. The pistol had a subtle clicking sound when the magazine is almost empty. The sound of razor blades bouncing off the walls just tings in your ears. In fact, every weapon sounds loud and powerful as it should. I blow off the head of a Skaar soldier with the rifle and it sounds amazing. Ambience is everywhere. I've played a lot of games where you only hear ambience in key areas to distinguish one area from another, but this game has some environmental noise playing in the background everywhere you go, and it still distinguishes one area from another. There's barely any voices to speak of, just the usual grunts and screams of all the actors in play, but the overall sound is just music to my ears. You'd be hard-pressed to find any audio that bothers you. The music itself is more like a combination of extra ambience and action game stuff. The levels with Nali structures have a much softer, ancient vibe to them, and the Skaar-themed levels like the mines or the spaceships have a more industrial sound to them. Nothing too memorable, but there might be 1 or 2 tracks that will get stuck in your head. Rather than the music itself, I would focus on how the music works in the game. It uses a less common system of modular music, using a tracker and sound samples of instruments sequenced together to produce the soundtrack, and this sequence can be changed on the fly to produce music based on what's happening in the game. It's not done all the time when an enemy is alerted to your presence, but there are some occasions, like this one, when all the exits are locked, it's a trap, the music changes, and you have to kill everyone before the music will change back and you can move on. That type of scenario is not very common, but when the music comes on, you know it's go time. The graphics are the real meat and potatoes of the Unreal Engine's debut. It has the ability to add in extra details to textures up close, so while games like Quake 2 showed you a blurry mess or massive pixels in the textures depending on the renderer, Unreal showed you natural wear and tear on the walls. The maps are so distinct and detailed that you can easily distinguish one area from another. You have wide open areas of grasslands and waterfalls, long corridors and spaceships and ancient temples, and projectiles and items lighting up the dark areas of the map. The game has a wide variety of environments in play: spaceships, mines, villages, and temples on a mountain. There's a very good mix of open space and claustrophobic areas. The wide open fields don't feel too empty or boring, and the tight corridors are still large enough to move around and dodge attacks. The lighting becomes an integral part of the gameplay, where monsters can hide in the shadows and take you by surprise, and it really sets the mood for the overall game. The 3D models for the weapons are out of this world, and the monsters look mean as hell, but they are showing their age by now. Obviously, the geometry and the models are blocky, but you can see for yourself why Unreal was a big deal in 1998. It's a vivid game world created with attention to detail. With all the praise and rave reviews the game had, it's hard to imagine the criticism it had during its rough development. The game wasn't working properly prior to the original release date, so naturally they pushed it back. The texture mapper was rewritten from scratch 7 times. Each iteration incorporated major changes to its design. Collision code was rewritten 3 times, networking code twice, sound interface twice. This caused huge delays to the game's release, which many publications and gamers alike have criticized. These rewrites of the code took over 18 months to complete, but only the final versions were good enough to ship. There's a lot to be said about a game that's delayed like this, and it took over 3 years from inception to get the game out the door, but in the end, all was forgiven because they delivered a really good game, and it showed how confident they were with their product, especially the graphics. There were multiple versions of the jewel case, but they all featured a different screenshot of the game. The retail box had an opening on the front, so you could see the screenshot on the jewel case front and center. There were a few notable changes made to the original plan for the game. The 8-ball gun originally launched 8 missiles, hence the name, but then playtesting revealed it to be too powerful, so they scaled it down to 6, but they kept the name. Other planned features were cut from the final product, your character morphing into other shapes, allowing you to access areas that you otherwise couldn't in a human form, and a very ambitious idea to connect multiple deathmatch maps on the internet together using teleporters. Walk into a teleporter and appear on a completely different map, possibly on a different server. Of course, that feature can be seen in action in many open-world sandbox games these days, but a near impossible feat to perform in the 90s, especially for a deathmatch mode. And speaking of deathmatch, this was one of the more popular game modes of the 90s. Fast-paced player-on-player action, everyone wanted a piece no matter what the game was. But for a game like Unreal, this was also one of the most criticized features in the game. The one critical flaw was the networking code. Even with all the rewrites, it was still not up to par for what everyone hoped for. The forums filled up with hundreds of complaints about the lag and the unresponsiveness of the online multiplayer, especially those on 56K modems. Epic's forums earned the nickname of Epic Flameboards. In response to this, they released dozens of patches to the game to address this and eventually added support for Direct3D and OpenGL in addition to their support for glide and software rendering. The biggest saving grace for the multiplayer throughout this ordeal was the bots. This was also one of the more enjoyable features of the game that stood out from everything else on the market. Unreal, at launch, had support for multiplayer bots. So after you're finished going through a single player, you can set up your own deathmatch experience very quickly and easily, no messing with server software or any add-ons. A small expansion to the game called Return to Napoli was sent out the door a few months later. Many of you have never heard of it because it was more of a silent release. Legend Entertainment was responsible for making it under the supervision of Epic Games. The marketing of the expansion was non-existent, and many of the Unreal fans never knew it existed until it was bundled with the game in the form of Unreal Gold or Unreal Anthology. It's purely single-player, serving as a continuation for Prisoner 849's story. There were a few levels that were scrapped from the original game. They made their appearance here in the expansion, but this feels like filler content more than anything. I can only imagine the expansion was nothing more than a way to make some extra cash from the leftover content. Some of the levels were already made, just add a few more things like an assault rifle, polish it up, and ship it. But without telling the fans, very few people had even heard of it back then, let alone played it. One of the other criticisms that Unreal had was the lack of a public demo or shareware version. The only real demos of the game were tech demos, included with various products, like a trial of the game bundled with a Sound Blaster card to show off its capabilities. There was no real way to try the game before you bought it, and this frustrated a lot of people back in the day, myself included. The game also lacked a console port, and with the graphical prowess it demands, that's no surprise since there's no way a console of the time could even run it, let alone a 4-year-old PC. Deciding on a purchase was difficult without the ability to try before you buy, and you would think that the higher requirements would make the game less accessible. But video game history speaks for itself when the game sells over 1 million copies. These days, 1 million copies is a pat on the back for a job well done. 1 million copies in 1998 was a huge deal. Once you get past all the setbacks and criticism, all that's left for people to remember is the fact that Epic Games delivered a really good game to market. It doesn't simply try to have more weapons or immerse you in an epic battle between good and evil. It tries to be different, and it does it with its variety and challenge. Understanding the story is completely optional. You can just play the game normally and complete the levels like any other game, or you can read up on the literature you come across and learn about how the Skaar dominated the Nali populace, and hopefully not kill the Nali in the process. It's also a great example of the technical challenges in game development and what you can achieve if you delay its release, when you delay it for the right reasons. Unreal is a monumental achievement in 3D gaming, and you need to take the time to experience this piece of gaming history.